Ruth Vanderberg watched two city men drive survey stakes through Amos's rose bed at 7 in the morning, and she did not cry. She counted them. 11 stakes. One for every year she'd been a widow, though the men in the yard didn't know that, and wouldn't have cared if they had. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup going cold in her hand. The younger one hit the stakes with a rubber mallet. The older one held a clipboard, and across the top of that clipboard, in block letters she could read from 30 feet, it said Corliss Renewal District. 3 days later, the mayor himself came to her gate. His name was Curtis Rademacher, and he wore a good coat, and up and down Fenwick Street the neighbors came out onto their porches to watch, because a mayor does not walk to a widow's fence unless something is being taken. He smiled the whole time. That was the part she remembered. "The house is a widow's, Mrs. Vanderberg," he said. "Not a fortress. Sign the paper, or the city signs it for you." 41 families on Fenwick Street got the same brown envelope that spring, the same figure typed inside. $4,200 for a home a man had paid off with 2 lifetimes of small paychecks. That night I went down to the cellar and opened my husband's abstract books for the first time since we buried him. Because a house the city calls worthless does not get handed to a private developer for $1. Not unless somebody is being paid to look the other way. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I go on, if a story about one stubborn woman and a stack of old deeds is the kind of thing you're here for, take a second and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from. I want to see how far Fenwick Street travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. And let me do it slow, because the beginning is the part everybody forgets to look at. 214 Fenwick Street was brick. Built in 1911 by a bricklayer named Ostrander, who laid every course himself and cut his initials into the cornerstone, where nobody would ever find them but a child crawling under the porch. Ruth had found them once, in 1934, the first summer she and Amos rented the upstairs rooms. She was 26 then. She showed Amos, and Amos ran his thumb over the letters and said a man ought to sign his work, and it was the kind of thing he said that made her marry him. They rented for 9 years. They bought in 1943, with the war on and money tight, and the bank in no mood to be generous. Amos took the mortgage the way he took everything, careful and slow, reading every line twice, asking the loan man questions the loan man didn't want to answer. It took them 18 years to pay it off. 2 Depression paychecks stretched over one table, a garden that fed them through the lean months. A porch swing Amos hung himself, with chain he oiled every spring so it wouldn't sing. They paid the last dollar in 1961. Ruth remembered the day. Amos came home from the Corliss Abstract and Title Office where he'd worked 34 years, and he didn't say a word, just laid the canceled note on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with both hands. Then he found a frame in the cellar, an old one, and he hung that paper on the wall over the stove, where they'd both see it every day, where the steam from the supper pot would rise up past it. "So we never forget it's ours," he said. He was the county's most careful title abstractor. That was not a thing people bragged about, being careful with deeds, but in Corliss it meant something. When a farm changed hands, when a widow needed to know if her dead husband had left the land clean, when a bank wanted to be sure nobody had a claim buried 40 years back, they came to Amos Vanderberg. He read the chain. He read who owned a thing and when and how they came to own it and who might still have a shadow of a claim on it. He kept leather ledgers, dozens of them, in a careful hand, and he taught the boy who came up under him the same care. That boy was Walt Petrakis, and he mattered later, so hold on to him. Amos died in 1966. Heart, he was in the garden when it happened, on his knees in the dirt, and Ruth found him there, among the roses he'd planted the year they bought the house. He'd have hated the fuss. 300 people at the church, and half of them people whose land he'd cleared, whose titles he'd made whole, and every one of them shook her hand and said the same thing. He was a careful man. He was so careful. His ledgers stayed in the cellar after he was gone. Ruth couldn't touch them at first. Then she couldn't touch them, because touching them was worse than leaving them. Walt came by one Sunday that first winter, and he stood at the top of the cellar stairs and looked down at the shelves the way a man looks at a church he's afraid to enter. And Ruth said, "Offhand, drying a plate, you take those someday, Walt. Amos would want them going to you. I never thought I'd need to open them myself." She said it, and she meant it, and she put it out of her mind. That is how the important things get said. Casually, over a dish towel, years before you understand what you've promised. There was a son, once, Daniel, killed in Korea in 1951, 20 years old, buried in a box the army sealed and told them not to open. Ruth and Amos read the newspaper on the porch swing every evening for the rest of their lives together, and neither of them ever said his name over the paper, and both of them thought it every single time. That was the house. That was what $4,200 was supposed to buy. Now, the stakes. It was the second week of April 1969, and the crocuses were up along the front walk, and Ruth was making coffee when she heard the truck. City truck, gray, the seal on the door. She watched two men climb out with a transit and a bundle of wooden stakes, and she watched them come through her gate without knocking, and she watched the young one lift his mallet over Amos's rosebed. She went out. She didn't run. She was 61 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that running gave the other man the idea he'd startled you. "Those are inside my fence," she said. The older man looked up from his clipboard. He had a soft, apologetic face, the face of a man who did unpleasant things for a paycheck, and told himself the paycheck made it fair. "Renewal District Survey, ma'am." "We're just marking. Nothing's decided. 11 stakes through my husband's roses is a decision," Ruth said. Somebody decided. The young one had already driven 3. The wood went in easy where the soil was soft from Amos's 40 years of working it, and each stake came down through a root, and Ruth stood there and counted, because counting was the only thing she could do that would not shame her. 11. When they were done, the older man tipped his hat and said, "Sorry for the trouble, ma'am," and they drove off, and old Mr. Ferris, her only close neighbor now that the Kowalskis had died, stood on his porch the whole time and watched with his hands hanging at his sides. Ruth went inside. She took Amos's Kodak down from the hall closet, the folding one, and she loaded it with the last roll of film in the drawer, and she went back out into the yard and she photographed every stake. From the fence, so the fence showed. So anyone who ever looked at the picture would see the stakes were inside her line and not the city's. She didn't know yet why she was doing it. Her husband had taught her, without ever saying it in words, that when a powerful man does a thing to you, you write down the date and you keep the proof, because the powerful man is counting on you having nothing. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and she wrote a letter. To the city engineer, by name, a man named Pruitt, whose office she'd found in the phone book. She wrote that the survey stakes placed on the 9th of April were within her fenced property line, that her late husband had established that line with the county in 1943, and that she wished the record to show she objected. She walked it to the post office herself and paid the extra for certified mail, so there would be a green card with a signature coming back to her, proving they'd received it. The green card came back. The letter got no answer. That was the first warning she gave them, and the first one they threw away. Remember that, because at the end of this, the throwing away is what hangs them. The envelope came in May. Brown, government brown, with the city seal, and inside a single sheet that called itself a notice of appraisal and offer of just compensation. Ruth read it standing at the mailbox. The house at 214 Fenwick Street had been appraised by the city, it said, in connection with the Corliss Renewal district, and the city offered $4,200 for the fee simple. And she had 30 days to accept, and if she did not accept the matter, would proceed to condemnation. $4,200. She stood there a long moment, not crying. She had decided somewhere back in April that she was done crying where the street could see her. Down the block, she saw Alma Reyes standing at her own mailbox with the same brown envelope, and past Alma, the Okonkwo's, and across the way the widower Delgado, and it dawned on Ruth, slow and cold, that the number in her envelope was the number in every envelope. They hadn't appraised her house. They hadn't appraised anybody's house. They had picked a number and typed it 41 times. That was the evening she first went down the cellar stairs. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to make supper and go to bed and be strong in the morning. But the number sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, and around 9 o'clock she found herself standing at the top of the cellar stairs, the way Walt had stood 3 winters back, afraid of a room full of a dead man's care. Then she went down. The ledgers were where he'd left them. Leather spines, gone soft with handling, each one lettered in his hand. She didn't know what she was looking for. She ran her fingers along the spines, and she thought about his voice, and after a while she pulled down the one marked General, Law and Principle, because that was the one he'd made himself. Not for any client, just his own notes. 34 years of a careful man writing down the rules he lived by. She carried it up to the kitchen, and she opened it under the light, and she turned pages in his handwriting until she found it. He'd copied it out years ago, in ink, in his small square letters. The doctrine of eminent domain, the power of the government to take private property. And underneath, in his own words, the thing that mattered. Private property may be taken for public use upon payment of just compensation. Public use. A road, a school, a courthouse, a reservoir, something the public holds and uses. The power does not extend, Amos had written, and here he'd pressed the pen down harder so the line stood up off the page. The power does not extend to taking a man's house to hand it to another private party. That is not public use. That is theft, wearing a permit. Ruth read it out loud in the empty kitchen. She read it twice. Then she sat back and she thought about the word on the clipboard, and the word in the newspaper, and the word the mayor's own campaign posters used, up on every corner in town. R.E. elect Rademacher, A. modern Corliss. Renewal, urban renewal. That was the phrase, wasn't it? That was the phrase they'd wrapped the whole thing in. She had heard it 100 times that spring and never once turned it over. Now she did. Renewal. Renewing it for whom? A public road didn't need 41 families evicted for $4,000 a house. A school didn't get built and handed to somebody. Renewal meant the block would be new, yes, but new belonging to whom? The next morning she put on her good dress, and she walked downtown to the council clerk's office, and she filed a formal objection. The clerk was a tired woman named Bledsoe, who took the paper and stamped it, and told her the council would take all objections under advisement at the regular meeting. Ruth asked for a copy of the stamp, the date, the receipt. Bledsoe gave it to her, a little surprised, and later Bledsoe would remember that the widow Vanderberg had asked for proof, had stood at the counter and waited for the green ink to dry, and that was the second warning, filed and stamped and witnessed, and thrown in the same drawer as the first. But she still didn't know who was buying the block. That was the loop that wouldn't close. Public use, her husband's ledger said. Then, who was the public use for? She walked home past the campaign posters, and she looked at the mayor's printed face, and she thought, you know. You know who it's for, and you're counting on me never finding out. The council chamber was full the night they gavelled her down. 41 families. They came in their church clothes, the Fenwick Street people, and they filled the folding chairs and they stood along the back wall, and Ruth sat in the second row with her objection receipt folded in her purse. She looked around the room once for the press bench, the little table by the side where the courier man usually sat, and it was empty. Somebody had made sure of that. You do not gavel down a widow in front of a reporter if you can help it. Mayor Rademacher ran the meeting from the center of the long table, and he was good at it, smooth and warm, calling people by their first names. When the Renewal District came up on the agenda, he read a prepared statement about progress, about a modern Corliss, about how the old Fenwick block had become. And here he used a word Ruth would carry the rest of her life. Blighted. Blighted 40, one paid off homes, gardens, porch swings, canceled mortgage notes framed over stoves. Blighted, he asked if there were objections to be heard, in the tone of a man who has already decided how long he will allow them to be heard. Ruth stood. She was calm. She had promised herself that. She said her name and her address, and she said that her husband had spent 34 years in this county reading titles, and that she had read her husband's books, and that the law was plain. Property taken by the city had to be taken for public use, and she wished the council to state, on the record, what public use was served by taking her house. A road? A school? She would like the public purpose named in the record tonight. Rademacher smiled at her the way you smile at a child who has done a small clever thing. Mrs. Vanderberg, he said, the redevelopment of a blighted district is a public purpose recognized by the state. The council thanks you for your comment. And he brought the gavel down. Once, objection noted. Next item. That was all. 20 seconds. The through line of a life, and he gavelled it in 20 seconds, and moved to the matter of a stop sign on Delano Street. The Fenwick people filed out into the spring dark, not talking much. Ruth walked home alone up her own street, and she was almost to her gate when the car pulled up beside her. The mayor's car. He got out, and the porches, which had watched the stakes go in and the envelopes come out, watched now, because the light was still on in half the front rooms, and people had been waiting to see if the widow would come home broken. Rademacher walked to her gate. There was another man in the car, a heavy-set man in a brown suit, who did not get out, who Ruth would later learn was Roy Kessler of Halcyon Development, but that night he was just a shape behind glass. I wanted to say this to you private, the mayor said, so it doesn't get ugly. The house is a widow's, Mrs. Vanderberg, not a fortress. You can sign the paper, or the city signs it for you. 30 days. And he took from his coat a folded document, and he held it out over the top of her own gate, and it was a notice of condemnation and order to vacate, and it gave her 30 days to be out of the house she and Amos had paid for, with 18 years and 2 dead children's worth of love. Ruth took it. She didn't argue. Arguing was what he wanted, a scene on the sidewalk the porches could talk about. She took the paper, and she looked at it, and she looked at him, and she said, "Quiet. You keep using that phrase. Urban renewal." She said the 2 words slow and whole, the way you set 2 things on a table to look at them. My husband taught me to be careful of a phrase that's doing a lot of work. What exactly is being renewed here, Mr. Mayor, and who ends up holding it when the renewing's done? Something passed over his face. Just a flicker. Then the smile came back down over it like a shade being drawn. "Good night, Mrs. Vanderberg," he said, and he got in his car. But before the car pulled away, the man in the brown suit finally got out, and he walked up to the front of Ruth's house with a little pry bar in his hand. And while the mayor watched, and the porches watched, and Ruth stood frozen at her own gate, he reached up to the brass numbers Amos had cut and mounted beside the door, 214, in solid brass. Amos had made them on the lathe at the shop, and mounted them himself the summer they paid off the note. And he worked the pry bar behind the 2, and he popped it loose, and he pocketed it. "Survey reference," he said, to nobody. "We mark the corner units." Then he got in the car and they drove off, and the numbers beside Ruth's door read 14, and there was a pale rectangle in the brick where the two had been for 8 years. Ruth stood at her gate a long time. Then she went up the walk, and she got down on her knees, in the flower bed under the door, in the dark, in her good dress. And she felt through the mulch until her fingers found it. The brass, too. Warm still from the man's pocket. She held it in her fist, and she stood up, and she went inside, and she did not cry, and she set the numeral on the kitchen table under the cancelled mortgage note, and she looked at it, and she made a decision that changed everything that came after. She was going to let them think she was leaving. That was the whole of it, at first. She was going to let Curtis Rademacher and the man in the brown suit and every soul on Fenwick Street believe that the widow Vanderberg had been beaten and was packing to go. Because a woman who is packing is a woman who is finished, and a finished woman is a woman nobody watches. And Ruth Vanderberg had spent 34 years married to a man who found the truth by being the one person in the room that nobody was watching. The next morning she pulled the empty apple crates up from the cellar, and she stacked them on the porch where the street could see. She wrapped a few dishes in newspaper. She let Alma Reyes catch her doing it. And she let her voice go tired and small when Alma asked. And she said she supposed there was no fighting the city, and she watched that travel down the block by noon. By supper time, the whole street believed it. By the next week, even Kessler's men, driving past to check their stakes, saw the crates on the porch and the curtains coming down. And they crossed 214 Fenwick off whatever list they kept in their heads. The widow's handled. She's going. By day she packed. By evening she read. She started with the appraisal, because the appraisal was the lie she could touch. $4,200. She took the bus to the county library downtown, and she asked the reference woman for the records of recent property sales. And she learned they were public, and she learned how to read them, though she'd never had to before. Amos had always been the one who read them. It took her 3 afternoons. But she found what she was looking for. Delano Street. 2 blocks over, outside the Renewal district line. Same brick houses, same year, same size, built by the same men in the same decade. And the Delano Street houses, when they sold private, hand to hand, for $11,000 and $11,500. Not $4,200. 11.5. The houses inside the Renewal district were worth exactly what the houses outside it were worth. The only thing that made a Fenwick house worth $4,200 was a piece of paper that said it was blighted, and that piece of paper had been signed by a city appraiser. And the appraiser's name was typed at the bottom of the notice in her purse, and when Ruth finally looked at that name closely, under the library lamp, she felt the floor tilt. Dale Merrow. She knew the name. Everybody in Corliss knew the name. Dale Merrow was the mayor's brother-in-law, married to Rademacher's sister Enid. He'd stood up at the wedding. There'd been a picture in the Courier years back. The man who set the value of 41 homes at $4,200 each was the mayor's own brother-in-law. Ruth sat in the library with her husband's carefulness rising up in her like a tide. That was not yet a crime she could prove. A man could be an appraiser and a brother-in-law both, and it might mean nothing. But her husband's voice was in her ear now, the thing he'd said 100 times over 100 titles. When you find one thing that's wrong, Ruthie, you don't stop. You pull the thread. A crooked deed is never crooked in just one place. Who was buying the block? That was still the loop that wouldn't close. Public use, the mayor swore. But a private appraiser married into the mayor's family had marked the price down to 1/3 of its worth, and you don't mark a price down for the public. You mark it down for a buyer. Somebody was going to get 41 homes for $4,000 apiece, and Ruth meant to know who. She went home. She packed a box for show. And that night, the night everything turned, She stood at the top of the cellar stairs, and she thought about a promise she'd made over a dish towel 3 winters ago. "You take those someday, Walt. I never thought I'd need to open them myself." Then she went down, and this time she didn't run her fingers over the spines and remember her husband. This time she took the ledgers under both arms, as many as she could carry, and she brought them up the stairs and she laid them out on the formica table under the good light. She went back for more. She made 3 trips, and when she was done the whole table was covered in leather and the whole kitchen smelled like her husband, like ink and old leather and pipe tobacco gone faint. And Ruth Vanderberg stopped being a widow the city was moving out of a house. She became a title abstractor tracing a chain. She set the brass 2 down at the corner of the ledger to hold the pages flat. A paperweight. Amos's brass, cut on Amos's lathe, holding open Amos's book. She found the county recorder's phone number, and she thought about how a person got to see recorded deeds, the sales and the transfers, the actual paper that showed who sold what to whom and for how much. Those were public too. Everything was public. That was the beautiful, terrible truth of it. They'd done the whole thing in the open, filed and stamped, because they'd been so sure that nobody who mattered would ever read it. And the boy at the county recorder's office, the clerk who pulled the deeds and filed the transfers and kept the great bound books of who owns what, the boy was Walt Petrakis. Amos's Walt. The one who'd come up under Amos, who'd stood afraid at the top of these very stairs. Ruth put on her coat. It was near 10 at night. She loaded the ledger she needed into a market basket, and the brass too with it, and she took her husband's abstract books and she drove downtown through the empty spring streets to the county building, where a light was still on in the back, because Walt Petrakis worked late on Thursdays, and she knocked on the glass, and when he opened the door and saw who it was, and saw the ledgers in her basket, his face changed the way a man's face changes when he understands that the careful work is not finished after all, that the old man had one more student, and she had only now, tonight, decided to come to school. "Mrs. Vanderberg," Walt said. "Walt," she said, "I need to see the Fenwick deeds, all of them, the recent transfers." She stepped into the light of the county recorder's office with her dead husband's books under her arm. "Somebody's buying my street for $1, and I am going to find out who, and I am going to need you to leave the door unlocked." Walt said nothing for a moment. He looked at the basket, at the ledgers, at the brass too she had tucked along the spine of the top book, like a bookmark. Then he stepped back from the door and let her in. The recorder's office, after hours, smelled of paper and radiator dust, and the particular dry warmth of a room that handles documents all day and never quite airs out. The overhead fluorescents were down to 1 bank, the one above Walt's clerk station, and it threw a long yellow rectangle across the linoleum floor. Ruth set her basket on the counter without asking permission. She had worked beside Amos in a room like this for 34 years, and the habit of belonging in a records room did not require an invitation. "The Fenwick parcels," she said. "The whole block. 312 to 390, plus the even side." Walt moved behind the counter. He had Amos's way of moving through stacks, economical and unhurried, as though every file were fragile, and the point was not to hurry, but to arrive at the right thing. He was 28 years old and already going thin at the temples, the way serious men do early. "How far back do you need?" he said. "Start with this year and work backward until I find the transfer to the city." He pulled the bound deed index for 1969. Ruth opened Amos's working ledger to the page she had flagged with a torn envelope, the page where Amos, in his cramped, steady hand, had written out the eminent domain statutes and the definition of public use 30 years ago when the term first started getting used creatively in the cities to the north. She had not read those pages since she filed the ledger on his shelf in 1966. She read them now. The index Walt set in front of her was organized by parcel number, each entry a line of ink, grantor, grantee, date, book, page, she ran her finger down the Fenwick parcels. The city's name appeared 9 times in the past 14 months. The price column repeated a single figure. She read it twice before she wrote it down, because she wanted to be certain she was reading correctly, that the decimal was where she thought it was. $1. She wrote it in the margin of her notepad, $1 and no cents, and then in the consideration column, plus assumption of renewal improvement bonds. The grantee on these transfers, she said, pull the deed itself for parcel 30604. Walt found the book and set it flat under the light. Ruth put on her reading glasses. The deed was 3 pages, standard form, with the legal description of the land in the long column of metes and bounds she could read as easily as a recipe. The grantor was the city of Corliss. The grantee was Halcyon Development Associates. She copied the grantee name into her notepad and underlined it twice. "Now show me," she said, "if Halcyon has filed anything else with this office in the last 6 months. Any recorded agreements. Any assignments. Anything that shows a payment going out." Walt was quiet for a moment. That would be in the Miscellaneous Instruments Index. Then, "Show me the Miscellaneous Instruments Index." He set it in front of her. She turned to the H's. Halcyon appeared once, in February, an instrument filed on the 14th. She read the entry, and then she sat very still, the way she had sat counting 11 survey stakes in the garden without moving, and her pencil moved in small, careful numbers across the notepad page. $38,000. Paid by Halcyon Development Associates to Tri-State Advisory Group. Consulting services rendered. "Walt," she said, "pull me the registration on Tri-State Advisory Group." Walt pulled the corporation index and set it beside her under the light. He was quiet while she found the tab. His hands were Amos's kind of hands, careful with the spine of a book, and she noticed it the way you notice a thing you've lost turning up in a stranger. Tri-State Advisory Group. Registered the previous October. One name on the incorporation papers as agent and sole officer. Dale Marrow. Ruth sat back. She did not gasp. She had learned a long time ago that the biggest facts come in the smallest print, and this one was no larger than the rest. Dale Marrow, city appraiser. Dale Marrow, the man whose signature stood at the bottom of 41 envelopes, each one offering $4,200 for a house worth $11,500. Dale Marrow, the mayor's wife's brother, who had sat at the Rademacher Thanksgiving table for as long as anyone in Corliss could remember. She wrote his name once. She did not underline it. Some things did not need a second line under them. "Walt," she said, "I need copies. The deed at $1. The consulting instrument at $38,000. This registration. Certified copies, with the recorder's seal, so no one can say I made them up on my kitchen table." He looked at her a moment. "Ruth, if I stamp these tonight, and it comes out that I stamped them for you, then say an old widow came in to get her affairs in order before she moved," Ruth said. "Which is the truth. I am getting my affairs in order. I am just not moving." He almost smiled. He ran the copies. The machine was loud in the empty office, and the seal pressed each page with a small, tired sound, and Ruth folded them and put them in Amos's leather portfolio, the one he'd carried to closings for 34 years, and she drove home under a sky going gray at the edges. The next morning she boxed the parlor. She did it where the street could see. She left the curtains open. She carried Amos's books up from the cellar in apple crates and stacked them on the porch, and she wrapped the good dishes in newspaper. And when Alma Reyes went by with her grocery cart, Ruth waved and said the movers were coming the end of the month. Alma's face did that thing faces do when they feel sorry for you and are relieved it isn't them. Ruth understood it. She did not hold it against her. By day, she was a widow surrendering. By night, she was an abstractor building a chain. She laid the ledgers out on the formica table, Amos's leather ones with the marbled edges, and she set the brass numeral 2 beside them, where it caught the kitchen light. She read the way he had taught her. Grantor to grantee. Consideration. Date of record. She built the whole thing on a single sheet of paper in her own hand, the arrows going down the page like water finding the low ground. The city takes 41 homes for public use, 4,200 each. The city sells the assembled block to Halcyon Development Associates. $1. Halcyon pays Tri-State Advisory Group $38,000 for consulting. Tri-State is Dale Merrow. Dale Merrow set the 4,200. Around and around, and every dollar that left the public came back into the family. She thought about Amos when she finished it. She thought he would have set down his pencil and taken off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he did, and said, "Well, Ruthie, there it is. It was always going to be somewhere. You just had to read to the bottom of the page. It nearly came apart on a Tuesday." She had gone back to the recorder's office in the afternoon because she wanted the parcel numbers to match the council's own resolution, and she was at the long oak table with the deed index open when a heavy-set man in a brown suit came through the front door. She knew him without being told. She had seen him standing behind the mayor at the gate, saying nothing, holding a clipboard. The way a certain kind of man is always standing behind another man. Roy Kessler. Halcyon's front. He did not see her at first. He went to the counter. Walt came up to meet him, and Ruth kept her head down over the index and turned a page she did not read. "I'll be quick," Kessler said. "Somebody's been in and out of the Fenwick deeds this month. Pulling them. I want to know who." Ruth's hands stayed flat on the book. She had counted 11 stakes in her garden without moving a muscle, and she found she could do the same thing now, could sit inside her own stillness the way you sit inside a coat. There was a pause. She heard Walt set something on the counter. "That'd be one of the widows off that block," Walt said. His voice was easy, bored, a clerk at the end of a long day, getting her affairs together before the move. They all do it. They come in, they want to see the old deed one last time, they cry a little, they go home. Sad business, honestly. Which widow? Couldn't tell you. Vander something, there's 40 of them, mister. I don't take their names down for looking at public record. Another pause. Ruth turned another page. Anybody helping her? Helping her look at a deed? Walt let a little laugh into it. It's her deed. You don't need help. It's got her name right on it. That's the whole point, isn't it? You folks are buying the block. You'd know their names better than I would. The floor creaked under Kessler's weight. Ruth felt his eyes go over the room, over the old woman in the gray coat, bent over the index like every other old woman who had ever come in to say goodbye to a piece of paper. His eyes did not stop on her. She was exactly what he expected to see, and a man never sees the thing he expects. He grunted and went out. The door swung shut, and the little bell over it rang and went quiet. Walt came around the counter. He was pale under the freckles. "Ruth, you did fine," she said. She closed the index. Her heart was going, but her hands were steady, and steady was the only part anybody could see. "You told him the truth. Every word. That's the trick of it, Walt. When you have the paper on your side, you never have to lie. You just have to let them keep believing what they already decided about you." She drove home. The eviction notice was on her door. The sheriff had come while she was out. He had nailed it right through the wreath, through the dried lavender Amos used to say kept the moths off, and the paper flapped a little in the spring wind. Firm date. The 9th of April. 30 days run out, and no appeal noted. Vacate the premises. She read it standing on her own porch in her own coat, and then she took it down, carefully, so as not to tear the wreath more than the nail already had, and she carried it inside and laid it on the table with the others. She had a small pile now, the certified letter to the engineer and its green card come back with no answer. the stamped objection, the notice of appraisal, the order to vacate, and now the eviction date. A little stack of the city telling her, in its own hand, on its own paper, every single thing it had done. She squared the edges, paper cut both ways. They had written it all down, and a man who writes it all down is a man who can be read. The bond vote was set for the first Monday in April. Open session. It had to be open, because the state required a public reading before renewal bonds could be sold, and that requirement was the last thing Curtis Rademacher had ever thought would matter to him. Ruth wrote 3 letters that morning. The first was to the one reporter at the county Courier who had ever printed a word against the mayor, a young man named Hobbs who covered the school board and the weather, and once, memorably, a zoning fight the mayor had lost. She wrote it plain. Come to the council session Monday. Sit in the front. Bring your pad. You will want to be able to say you were in the room. The second was to the state auditor's office in the Capitol, certified, green card requested. The way Amos had taught her that a thing you can prove you mailed is a thing that happened whether they answer or not. She enclosed the copies. The $1 deed. The $38,000 consulting fee. The registration of Tri-State Advisory Group showing Dale Merrow as sole officer. She wrote 1 page explaining what the 3 papers were when you laid them end to end, and she signed it. Ruth Vanderberg, widow of Amos Vanderberg, 34 years an abstractor of this county's titles. The third letter she did not mail. It was to Amos. She wrote it, and she read it, and she put it in the stove, and lit it, because some things you only need to have said once, to the person who taught you to say them. Then she took Amos's leather portfolio and the ledger with the eminent domain rule copied in his own hand, and she waited for Monday. The council chamber had not changed since the night they gavelled her down. The same long table on the raised floor, the same brass rail, the same portrait of some long-dead founder gone brown with varnish. The 41 families came again, because word had gone up and down Fenwick Street that the Vanderberg woman had asked to be heard at the bond vote, and even the ones who had signed and packed and half moved out already came back to see it, filling the folding chairs, standing along the back wall. Mr. Ferris was there, hat on his knee. Alma Reyes, the families with their children, and the old men who had poured concrete in this town for 50 years. The press bench was not empty this time. Young Hobbs sat in the front with his pad on his knee. Mayor Rademacher took his seat at the center of the long table. Dale Merrow was 2 chairs down, because a city appraiser had business at a bond vote. And he did not know yet that being in the room was the worst place he could possibly be. Kessler stood along the side wall with his clipboard, watching the crowd the way a man watches livestock. They read the bond resolution first. The clerk, Bledsoe, read it in his flat voice, the whole thing, the renewal district and the assembled parcels and the improvement bonds to be issued in the amount and so forth. When he finished, Rademacher lifted his gavel to move to the vote, and that was when Ruth stood up. Mr. Mayor, you have a public comment period before the vote. It's written into the same resolution. I'd like my 3 minutes. The room went still. Rademacher looked at her over the top of his glasses, and she watched him decide, the way a man decides whether a fly is worth the swat, that it would look worse to deny an old widow her 3 minutes in front of 41 families and a reporter than to let her have them and gavel her down when the clock ran out. He had gavelled her down before. It had cost him nothing. The chair recognizes Mrs. Vanderberg, he said. 3 minutes. Ruth came to the little rail. She did not raise her voice. She had thought about that, in the nights at the kitchen table. She had thought a great deal about not raising her voice, because a man like Rademacher knew exactly how to answer a woman who shouted, and had no answer at all for one who did not. I'm going to read you 3 numbers, she said. That's all. 3 numbers, and then I'm going to lay some paper on the clerk's table, and then you can take your vote." 2 minutes, 40 seconds, Rademacher said. "The first number is $4,200, Ruth said. "That's what the city offered me for my house. It offered the same number to every family in this room. 41 houses, 41 envelopes, 1 number. It was signed by the city's appraiser. She did not look at Merrow. She had decided not to look at him. 2 blocks over, on Delano Street, houses the same size, the same brick, the same year, sold last summer for $11,500. That's in the county's own records. Anyone here can go read it." I did. A murmur moved through the folding chairs. Rademacher's gavel hand rested flat on the table. "The second number is $1, Ruth said. "That's what the city sold this whole block for. Once it had taken it from us for public use, once it had the deeds all in one hand, it sold every house on Fenwick Street to a private developer called Halcyon Development Associates. For $1, plus assumption of the bonds you're about to vote to sell. It's recorded. Deed book of this county. I have the certified copy." She took it from the portfolio and she laid it on the clerk's table. Flat, squared. "Now, I spent 34 years next to a man who read deeds for this county," she said. "My husband Amos, he used to tell me that public use means a road. It means a school. It means a firehouse or a park or a thing that belongs to all of us. It does not mean handing a whole street to one man for $1. That's not a taking for public use. That's just a taking." Hobbs was writing fast now. She could hear his pencil. "The third number," Ruth said, "is $38,000. She let it sit a second in the still room. 3 weeks after Halcyon got this block for $1, Halcyon paid $38,000 to a company called Tri-State Advisory Group for consulting services. It's recorded too, same office. I have that copy as well." She laid the second document beside the first. "And I got curious, the way my husband taught me to get curious, and I pulled the registration on Tri-State Advisory Group to see who this consultant was that earned $38,000 off a $1 sale. It was filed with the county last October. 1 officer. 1 name." Now she looked at Merrow. She had said she wouldn't, but the moment came, and she looked. And he had gone the color of the varnished portrait behind him. "Dale Merrow," Ruth said. "The man who set the 4,200. The mayor's brother-in-law." She laid the registration down on top of the other 2. The room did not erupt. It did something worse than erupt for the men at the long table. It turned. Every face in every folding chair turned slow toward the raised floor, toward Rademacher, and it was the quiet of a courtroom, not a mob, and Ruth watched the mayor feel it land on him and have nowhere to put it. "You told me a widow can't read a deed, Mr. Mayor," she said. "You didn't say it in those words. But it's what you meant, that night at my gate, when you handed me the order and told me to sign or the city would sign for me. You thought a house full of old paper was just old paper." She gathered the empty portfolio to her chest. "My husband spent 34 years teaching me to read exactly this one." She sat down. Rademacher's gavel did not move. That was the thing people talked about after, for years, in Corliss. The mayor sat with the gavel in his hand, and the whole room, waiting for the little sound of it, the sound that ended every meeting. And it did not come. His knuckles were white on the handle. He looked out at 41 families and 1 reporter writing. And Ruth understood that he had finally done the arithmetic she had done weeks ago at her kitchen table, and it came out the same for him as it had for her. "This session," he said, and his voice was not the gate voice anymore, "is recessed." He brought the gavel down at last. It sounded like a door. What happened after did not happen all at once, and it did not happen because anyone rescued her. It happened because the paper was already written, and once it is written it keeps, and it went where paper goes when the right hands finally pick it up. The state auditor answered her certified letter within the week. Not to her, first to the county, and to the bond underwriters in the capital, a letter that froze the Corliss Renewal bonds pending review of the conveyance of public property for inadequate consideration. Without the bond money, Halcyon had nothing to assume. Without the assumption, the $1 deed was a gift of public land with no public purpose, and the whole thing was as void as a check written on a closed account. A grand jury seated in June. Ruth read it in the Courier, young Hobbs's byline over it, the block's name spelled right at last. Fenwick Street. The jury was hearing testimony on the tri-state consulting fee, the paper said, on the relationship between the city appraiser and the office of the mayor. She saw Rademacher once, that month, in the corridor outside the county clerk's office. He was coming out as she was going in, to file the paper that restored her deed clean, and they nearly met at the door. He looked older. The third-term banner that had hung over Main Street, Modern Corliss, had come down in a rain the week before, and no one had put it back up. He stopped. He looked at her a long moment. "This is temporary," he said. Dry, low, the voice of a man saying it to himself. "All right, Curtis," Ruth said, and she went in and filed her paper. It was not temporary. He was recalled in the fall, the first recall in the history of Corliss, and he did not run again for anything. Dale Merrow fell alone, which was the way he had built it, thinking that a shell filed clean with the county recorder would look like a business instead of a bucket. The registration he had filed to look legitimate became Exhibit A. A man who signs a public record cannot later say the record is a lie, and Merrow had signed his own name to the thing that hanged him. The State Board of Appraisers posted his license for revocation. They posted it on the same bulletin board in the county building where the notice of her condemnation had hung all spring, and Ruth went down one afternoon and stood in front of it, just to see the two notices in the same place, hers gone now and his going up, and she thought that the world did occasionally, if you were patient, balance its own books. Halcyon was the one that had to come to her. She had thought about that, too, in the long spring, and she had smiled at her kitchen table when she saw how it would go, because it had the shape of the thing Amos loved, the clean mechanical justice of a title. Halcyon could not close its financing on the Fenwick block without clear title to all of it, and there was one house on Fenwick Street whose deed had never gone to Halcyon at all, not for $1, not for anything, because the condemnation that took it had been voided before the ink dried on the transfer. 214 Fenwick, Ruth's house, the one deed she still held free and clear. Roy Kessler came to her porch on a Saturday in July. He came without the clipboard. He held his hat in both hands, and he stood at the bottom of her steps the way a man stands when he has finally understood the ground he is on. And he asked, very politely, whether he might have a word. Ruth was on the porch swing with her coffee. Amos's roses were coming back, where the crew had broken the soil, ragged but green, budding. She looked at Kessler over the rim of the cup. "You can have a word," she said. "Come up. The swing holds two." He came up. He did not sit at first. Then he did, because she waited, and a man cannot ask a favor standing over a seated widow, and he knew it. "Mrs. Vanderberg," he said. "I'll be plain. My company's in a difficult spot. We've got a great deal of money committed to this block, and it turns out we can't do anything with it, can't build, can't sell, can't borrow against it, without clean title to your parcel. 214, you've still got your deed." "I've still got my deed," Ruth agreed. "I'd like to buy it," Kessler said. "Fair price. More than fair. You name a number, Mrs. Vanderberg, and I expect we can meet it. I've got authority to be generous." Ruth swung a little, gentle, her foot pushing off the porch board Amos had nailed down in 1961. She looked out at the street, at the stakes long pulled, at Mr. Ferris's porch across the way, where he sat pretending not to watch and watching every second of it. "I'm not going to name a number in dollars, Miss Kessler," she said. He waited. My price is a piece of paper, Ruth said. 2. Actually, the first is a signed release. From you, from Halcyon, restoring every family on this street to their home. Every one of the 40. The deeds go back where they came from. Clean, no dollar owed, no bond assumed, the way they were before your survey crew ever put a stake in my husband's roses. Kessler was quiet. And the second? The second is a letter, Ruth said. Public, printed in the Courier, over your name. Saying what the Renewal district really was. That it was never Renewal. That it was a private carve-up of 41 families' homes, and that you and the city knew it, and that it's finished. She took a sip of her coffee. It had gone lukewarm, and she didn't mind. You do those 2 things, Mr. Kessler, and I'll sign my deed over to you for $1. The same dollar the city sold this street for. It seems only fair you should get the block at the price you agreed to pay for it. You'll just have to give the families back first. Kessler looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his heavy face eased. Almost relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a thing so long he's glad to set it down even at a loss. You're a hard woman, Mrs. Vanderberg, no, Ruth said. I'm a careful one. My husband was the hard one. He'd have charged you the $38,000. Kessler laughed once, surprised out of him. And he signed. She had the release drawn already, because she had known for weeks it would come to this. And she brought it out on Amos's old closing clipboard, and Roy Kessler of Halcyon Development Associates signed away his 3-block assemblage on Ruth Vanderberg's porch swing, and the letter, too, dated and witnessed. The pen was Amos's. Kessler never knew it. Ruth knew it, and that was enough. 6 months after the stakes, it was summer on Fenwick Street. The roses came back. That was the thing Ruth had not let herself count on, through the whole gray spring, because a woman who has buried a husband and a son knows better than to count on a thing growing back. But they came. Where the survey crew had driven the 11 stakes and broken the soil around Amos's bed, the canes threw up new green, and by July there were blooms. Red and heavy and a little wild from the disturbance, and Ruth cut them and put them in the blue pitcher on the formica table beside the cancelled mortgage note that still hung framed over the stove. The families were home. The moving trucks that had come in the spring had come back in the summer to carry everything the other direction, and the street filled up again with the ordinary noise of it. Children, screen doors, a lawnmower somewhere on a Saturday. Alma Reyes brought Ruth a pie and did not say anything about the sorry-for-you look she'd given her in the spring, and Ruth did not make her say it. Mr. Ferris sat on his porch and lifted his hat every time Ruth came out, which was a thing he had never done before the spring, and did every day after. Walt Petrakis got the ledgers. She gave them to him herself, carried them over in the apple crates, Amos's whole life in leather and marbled edges. 34 years of the county's titles read and kept. I told you a long time ago you could have these someday, Ruth said. I never thought I'd need to open them first. Walt held the top book the way Amos used to hold it, careful with the spine, and Ruth saw that they were in the right hands, and that was a thing paid off. Like a mortgage, like a debt, like a promise made good. She kept one thing back for herself. The brass numeral 2. It had sat on her kitchen table all spring, first under the cancelled note, then beside the ledger as a paperweight while she built the chain, holding down the corner of the page while she wrote the arrows going to the low ground. Kessler's man had pried it off the day of the vacate order, off 214, to mark the house for the survey, and left it hanging by one screw in the dirt of the flower bed where Ruth had found it, and picked it up and carried it inside. On a warm evening in July, she took Amos's screwdriver from the drawer where it had lived since 1966, and she went out to the porch, and she mounted the 2 back on the house, between the 1 and the 4. She had to stand on the little stool to reach, and her hands were 61 years old, and not as steady on a screwdriver as they were on a deed. But she got it. She tightened both screws. She stepped down and stood in the yard and looked up at it. 214. Whole again. The number Amos had cut and mounted with his own hands the first summer they owned the place, when the note still had 30 years to run, and their boy was small and running the length of the porch, and the whole long life of it still ahead of them, and none of it spent. She sat on the swing with a fresh cup of coffee. The evening was going gold at the edges, the good light, the light Amos used to say was the only honest hour of the day. The courier was folded on her knee to the page where her block's name was spelled right, Fenwick Street, in young Hobbes's careful type. The mayor recalled, it said, in a smaller line further down. Marrow disbarred. And out on the corner, where the sign had stood all spring, Halcyon Development Associates, future home of Corliss Renewal, there was nothing now but the 2 holes in the ground where the posts had been, and grass already growing up to hide them. She swung a little. The chain creaked in the old familiar place. She thought that people had believed. All of them, the mayor and Marrow and Kessler, and even kind Alma Reyes, that a quiet woman in a gray coat was a woman who could be moved. That quiet meant weak. That an old widow with a house full of her dead husband's paper would sign where she was told and be grateful for the $4,200. They had never once considered that quiet people are the ones who read the fine print. That a woman who says little may be a woman who is listening. That the paper, the powerful right to cheat you, is the same paper that convicts them, if you can read it, and if you are patient, and if you have loved someone careful enough to teach you how. The fine print keeps. That was the whole of it. Long after the loud men have shouted themselves out, the fine print is still there in the deed book, seal and all, waiting for the right pair of glasses. Ruth finished her coffee as the light went down over Fenwick Street, over the roses come back, and the number made whole, and the 40 homes lit up one by one along the block. Somewhere a screen door banged. A child was called in to supper. The swing creaked, and she let it. Wherever you're watching from tonight, comment the name of your town. I'd like to know how far Fenwick Street travels.